Yes. Oh, hello. I was just reading some Descartes. So let me tell you about rationalism versus empiricism. So in the last video, we looked at knowledge from perception, knowledge that requires experience of the world outside of our minds. But there are potential sources of knowledge that don't require experience, sources of knowledge that rely only on the resources we have within our minds. And that's essentially what the rationalism versus empiricism topic is all about. It's about the extent to which our knowledge comes from experience versus these other sources that rely only on the mind. So, broadly speaking, the empiricists say all our knowledge comes from experience, but the rationalists disagree. The rationalists say there are other sources of knowledge, such as innate knowledge, knowledge we're born with, and also that we can use intuition and deduction, i.e. the mind's capacities for reason, to learn about the world. So I've got to warn you, this topic does contain a fair bit of philosophical jargon, but once you get your head around the various concepts involved, I actually think it's one of the more interesting topics in epistemology. So dust off your philosophy dictionaries and let's talk about rationalism versus empiricism. So the first thing to talk about with this topic is the definitions involved. The thing is, a lot of these philosophers were talking about similar things before these definitions were even invented, so they don't always neatly fall into one category or the other. Basically, this rationalism versus empiricism topic is a bit of a mess, so I'm going to editorialize the story a bit in order to avoid this video being 10 hours long. So the first distinction we need to make is between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. So this a priori, a posteriori distinction is about the different ways we come to know something. A priori knowledge is knowledge that can be gained without any experience of the world outside of our minds. If you need help remembering this term, the clue is kind of in the name. A priori means prior to experience. So examples of a priori knowledge include mathematical truths such as 2 + 2 = 4. For example, you don't need to go out into the world and collect 2 stones and then another 2 stones, add them together, count them and get 4 in order to know that 2 + 2 = 4. You can work out 2 + 2 = 4 purely using your own mind. So 2 + 2 = 4 can be known a priori. Then the opposite of a priori knowledge is a posteriori knowledge. And this is knowledge that does require experience, knowledge that can't be gained without experience or perception of the world outside of our minds. And so, again, the clue is kind of in the name. A posteriori knowledge is knowledge that is acquired post-experience or after experience. So, examples of a posteriori knowledge may include something like water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. That's not something you could work out purely by thinking. You'd have to do perhaps a science experiment to verify it. Likewise, today is a sunny day. There's no way you could work that out purely by thinking, purely using your own mind. And so today is a sunny day is also an example of something that can only be known a posteriori. So the two sides of this debate disagree about how much of our knowledge is a priori and how much of our knowledge is a posteriori. So broadly speaking, the empiricists say all our knowledge is a posteriori and there's no such thing as purely a priori knowledge. This is a little bit of an oversimplification, but we'll get on to that. So empiricists say all our knowledge is a posteriori and requires experience, whereas the rationalists argue that we can use a priori sources of knowledge to learn about the world. So, broadly speaking, there are two ways the rationalists argue that we can use a priori methods to acquire knowledge. The first way is innate knowledge, knowledge you're born with. And obviously, when you've just been born, you haven't had any experience yet. So any innate knowledge would, of course, be a priori. So the other way the rationalists argue that we can acquire knowledge a priori is via what's known as intuition and deduction. So we'll get more into intuition and deduction later in the video, but basically intuition and deduction are just the use of the mind's reasoning and logic capacities to firstly see that certain propositions must be true, and then using logical deductions to derive further true propositions from what's already known, purely using the mind and reasoning. So intuition and deduction and innate knowledge are two ways that rationalism can reject the empiricist claim that all our knowledge comes from experience. So we're going to start by looking at the innate knowledge debate. So innate knowledge is knowledge you're born with, knowledge that's perhaps encoded in your genes somehow or preloaded into your mind. And obviously, when you've just been born, you haven't had any experience yet. So if innate knowledge exists, then that is one way we can argue that we have purely a priori knowledge and thus reject the empiricist claim that all knowledge is a posteriori. Just one extra thing to point out quickly here. When we're talking about innate knowledge here, we're talking about innate propositional knowledge specifically. So if you remember from the definitions of knowledge video a few videos back, we distinguish between ability knowledge, acquaintance knowledge, and propositional knowledge, knowledge of facts. And it's obviously uncontroversial that babies are born with some innate ability knowledge, such as the ability to breathe. Otherwise, they just die right off the bat. So the rationalist claim about innate knowledge is that we have innate propositional knowledge. So Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, is someone who could definitely be characterized as a rationalist because Plato believed in innate knowledge. Plato believed that before we're born into this physical world, we existed in a different kind of almost alternate dimension, the world of the forms. And the world of the forms is basically this world of ideal, perfect objects. But we don't need to worry too much about Plato's theory of forms for this video. But basically, Plato believes that when we exist in the world of the forms, we have perfect knowledge. And when we're born into our physical bodies, we forget this knowledge. And so all that we call learning within this life isn't actually learning, it's just remembering stuff that we already knew in the world of the forms. And so, according to Plato, all knowledge is effectively innate knowledge. It just needs to be remembered. Plato tries to prove his claim that all knowledge is just remembering in the dialogue Meno. And he attempts to show this by demonstrating how a slave who's never been taught geometry has knowledge of the geometric principle that a square with an area of 2a will have sides equal to the diagonal of a square with an area of 1a. So Socrates draws a square on the ground and divides it into 4 smaller squares. Just by asking questions and without telling the slave the answers, the slave agrees that this square has an area of 4 and sides each with a length of 2. So Socrates then asks the slave, if we were to double the area of this square, i.e. if we had a square with an area of 8, what would the length of the sides be? The slave initially answers 4. Double the area, double the sides, right? But Socrates draws this 4x4 square on the ground, and the slave realizes that if the sides are 4 in length, then the area will be 16 and not 8. The area has been quadrupled rather than doubled. So the slave realizes that the length of the sides must be somewhere in between 2, the original square, and 4, the square with an area of 16. So they try a 3x3 square, but that doesn't work either because the area of a 3x3 square will be 9 rather than 8. Eventually, Socrates draws a square like the original 2x2 square, but then draws diagonal lines across each of the 4 squares, dividing them into 8 triangles of equal size. If you look at this diagram, you could say there's a sort of smaller square in the middle of the bigger square that's composed of these 4 middle triangles. And this smaller square has an area of 4. If you look, it's made up of 4 triangles. Then if you look at the bigger square, you can see that it is composed of 8 triangles. It has an area of 8. So this is the point. The sides of the square with an area of 8 were equal to the diagonal line of the original square with an area of 4. And the general principle here is that a square with an area of 2a will have sides equal to the diagonal of a square with an area of 1a. And so Plato argues that the slave knows this geometry proof. He knows this geometry proof and can answer the questions correctly without being taught geometry. So Plato takes this to show that the slave's knowledge of this geometric proof is innate. This isn't a geometry lesson, it's philosophy. So just to emphasize the philosophical point here. The philosophical point is that the slave has never been taught geometry. He has no experience of geometry. And yet he seems to know this geometric proof, or at least can correct his mistakes when he makes them. So Plato takes this to show that the slave's knowledge of geometry must be innate. However, there's lots of ways the empiricist could potentially reject Plato's conclusion that the slave boy's knowledge here is innate. For example, you could argue that the slave was simply using reason to work out the correct answer. After all, it's not like he gave the correct answer right off the bat. He initially gives a bunch of wrong answers before arriving at the correct one, so perhaps he's just working out the answer as he goes. Or perhaps you could argue that asking questions, as Socrates does to the slave boy, is itself a form of teaching, or perhaps some combination of both these explanations. The slave boy bit in Meno is not particularly long, so perhaps it's worth reading for yourself and deciding whether you think the slave's knowledge here really is innate, or whether Socrates is basically forcing the poor slave to say the right answer. Perhaps a stronger argument for innate knowledge is Leibniz's argument from necessary truths, that knowledge of necessary truths is innate. So, I'm sorry to throw yet another definition at you, but we have to make this distinction between a necessary truth and a contingent truth. So, firstly, a contingent truth is something that is true, but that might not have been true, or that doesn't have to be true. So, for example, Paris is the capital of France is a contingent truth because while it is true, it could have been false if whoever decided to make Paris the capital had decided to make Marseille or Lyon the capital instead. Likewise, even something like the sun rises in the east is a contingent truth because if the laws of physics had been different, the sun might rise in the west, or at some point before the earth existed, the sun didn't rise in the east because the sun didn't rise at all. So something like the sun rises in the east is also a contingent truth because while true, it might not be true, or yeah, it might not have been true. In contrast, necessary truths are truths that are true, have always been true, and couldn't possibly be false. So an example of a necessary truth that Leibniz gives a few times is that it's impossible for the same thing to both be and not be simultaneously, which is known as the principle of non-contradiction. Mathematical truths are also typically understood to be necessary truths. So 2 + 2 = 4, for example. It just wouldn't make sense that in any universe, 2 + 2 could give you anything other than 4. So this is the argument. We know that 2 + 2 = 4 is not just true, it's necessarily true. But how do we know it's necessarily true? If I get these 2 onions and these 2 sweet potatoes, and I add them together and I get 4 vegetables, experience can only tell me that I got 4 in this particular instance. But if all I had was my experience, how would I know that, the next time I add 2 things to 2 things, I wouldn't get a different number? Well, that's never going to happen. You could add 2 things to 2 things from now until the end of time, and you would always get 4. Or even if I was transported to another dimension where time runs backwards and aliens walk on the ceiling, I would still know that 2 + 2 = 4 because 2 + 2 is necessarily equals 4. What are you talking about, man? So Leibniz's point is that experience can only tell us what is true in this particular instance, or that particular instance, what's contingently true. And yet we know that certain propositions, such as 2 plus 2 equals 4 and non-contradiction, are necessarily true. So Leibniz argues that our knowledge that necessary truths are necessarily true must be innate. Leibniz's new essays on human understanding, where the necessary truths argument we just talked about comes from, was actually written in response to John Locke's essay concerning human understanding. And these two guys were contemporaries. They met each other and they met to discuss these and other topics. So whereas Leibniz thinks the mind at birth contained innate knowledge of necessary truths, Locke's view is basically the complete opposite. Locke argued that the mind at birth is a tabula rasa, which is Latin for blank slate. In other words, Locke believed that the mind at birth contained no knowledge, and instead all our knowledge must ultimately come from experience. So Locke gives a hypothesis, if you will, about how all knowledge is built up from experience. So Locke distinguishes between two different types of experience: sensation, which is basically sense perception, and reflection, which is experience of thought, basically experience of the operations of the mind. So sensation can give us simple ideas, such as blue or square. So for Locke, simple ideas are ideas that can't be broken down into anything simpler. Imagine a baby looking at the sky on a clear day, for example. This experience of sensation may give the baby the simple idea of blue. But more complex experiences, more complex sensations, can also give us complex ideas, which are basically just combinations of these various simple ideas. For example, the baby may develop the complex idea of the sea by combining the simpler ideas of blue and cold and water and wet and so on. So complex ideas also come from experience. But experience doesn't just include passively receiving sensations like this. Our experience can also include the active combination of these ideas within the mind. So, for example, even though a person may never have had experience of a unicorn, for example, because unicorns don't exist, the idea of a unicorn ultimately is grounded in experience because it's formed from simpler concepts that do come from experience, such as white, horse, and horn. So, in Locke's view, all knowledge can ultimately be broken down into experience this way. Complex ideas are composed of simpler ideas, but all ideas are ultimately grounded in experience. And so, if we can account for all knowledge via experience, via sensation and reflection, then Locke would argue that we don't need innate knowledge, given that all knowledge can be explained via experience. There's no room left for the innate knowledge hypothesis. Innate knowledge is redundant, in other words. Locke also attacks a different argument in favour of innate knowledge, that because certain truths are agreed on by everybody, then they must be innate. Firstly, Locke argues, even if it were true that there were these propositions that everybody agreed on, that wouldn't prove they were innate, because that knowledge could be explained in other ways using experience, such as the story of simple and complex ideas we just went over. But what's worse, says Locke, is that there aren't even any examples of propositions that really are universally agreed on. We saw how Leibniz argued that knowledge of necessary truths such as 2 plus 2 equals 4 and non-contradiction must be innate. But Locke argues that children and idiots, and that's a direct quote by the way, Locke argues that children and idiots don't appear to know these truths. If you look at a newborn baby, for example, there's no reason to suspect that the baby knows that 2 plus 2 equals 4, or that it's impossible for the same thing to be and not to be simultaneously. There's no reason to suspect that the baby knows anything. So Locke rejects this idea that because certain propositions are agreed on by everybody, that's innate knowledge, because there are no such propositions that are agreed on by everybody. So Leibniz isn't happy to let Locke have the last word here, and the back and forth between Leibniz and Locke could justify its own video. But what a lot of their disagreement comes down to sort of different definitions of what would count as innate knowledge. So for Locke, something can't be innate knowledge if it's not something you've ever been consciously aware of. But Leibniz is sort of operating on a different understanding of what innate knowledge would look like. Leibniz says innate knowledge doesn't have to be conscious. It's not like a baby comes out the womb right off the bat knowing that 2 plus 2 equals 4 and that it's impossible for the same thing to be and not to be simultaneously. However, Leibniz says the baby and all minds have an innate predisposition to understanding these necessary truths. So where Locke describes the mind at birth as a tabula rasa, Leibniz describes the mind at birth as more like a block of marble. I don't know what your knowledge of stonemasonry is like, but take it from Leibniz that a block of marble has a load of veins running through it. And these veins give the marble a tendency to take a particular shape when struck by a sculptor. So, according to Leibniz, our minds at birth are similar to the marble. In the same way that the marble has a tendency to take a particular shape when struck by the sculptor, the mind has an innate tendency to understand necessary truths when exposed to experience. And this tendency exists within the mind at birth. And maybe Leibniz has a point here. Obviously babies don't come straight out the womb saying it's impossible for the same thing to be and not to be simultaneously, but as soon as they acquire language, they seem to innately grasp the principle of non-contradiction. So, for example, if you say to a toddler that it's your birthday today, but it's not your birthday today, they're going to have a confused expression on their face because they innately know that that doesn't make sense, that those two things contradict each other. Or once a child's old enough to have learned its own name, try telling it that their name is something different and they'll innately know to disagree with you because they innately grasp that if their name is Christian, for example, that it's not possible for their name to be James because that would be a contradiction. Just to be clear here, Leibniz isn't saying we're born with innate knowledge of these specific examples, such as knowing what day your birthday is or knowing what your name is. But Leibniz is saying we are born with innate predisposition towards the principle of non-contradiction and other necessary truths, and that once we have experience, we're able to apply these innate principles to the specific examples, such as the ones just given. So to summarise the innate knowledge debate, Locke the empiricist argues that all our knowledge ultimately comes from experience. And then the innatist philosophers, such as Plato and Leibniz, disagree. So Plato argues that all our knowledge is ultimately innate and just needs to be remembered, which is maybe a bit of a tough claim to defend, but Leibniz doesn't go quite that far. Leibniz argues that our knowledge of necessary truths must be innate because experience can only tell us what is true, what's contingently true, not what must be true, such as necessary truths. An important point to emphasise, though, is that both Plato and Leibniz would admit that it does take some degree of experience to reveal the innate knowledge. And this last point, that it takes experience to reveal innate knowledge, makes the innate knowledge debate a tough one to call, because how do you know whether the experience is teaching the knowledge, as Locke would claim, or whether the experience is just revealing the innate knowledge, as Plato and Leibniz would claim? So that's the innate knowledge debate done, but the rationalists still have another approach through which they can attack empiricism, and that's intuition and deduction. So I know I said earlier that empiricists say all knowledge comes from experience, that all knowledge is a posteriori, but that was a bit of an oversimplification. You see, even the empiricists would accept that there are certain propositions that can be known entirely a priori, such as mathematical propositions. For example, like the stones example earlier, you don't need to do an experiment to know that 2 + 2 = 4. It's something you can work out purely using your mind. Even the empiricists would agree with this. So this is where I throw another definition at you, and that is the distinction between an analytic proposition and a synthetic proposition. So analytic propositions are propositions that are true in virtue of what the words mean, true by definition. So mathematical propositions are examples of analytic propositions, such as 2 + 2 = 4. That's just what the words mean. Another example of an analytic proposition would be something like all triangles have 3 sides, because that's just what the word triangle means, 3-sided shape. And then the classic example of an analytic truth that's always used in philosophy is that all bachelors are unmarried. Again, that's just what the word bachelor means. It's an unmarried man. And so the concept bachelor already contains the word unmarried. And so all bachelors are unmarried is an example of an analytic truth. It's true by definition. And so even both the rationalists and the empiricists would agree that we can know analytic truths a priori. You don't need to do an experiment and survey all the bachelors in the world to know that all bachelors are unmarried. So where the rationalists disagree with the empiricists is on the status of synthetic truths. So synthetic truths are still true, but they're true in virtue of how the world is rather than what the words mean. So for example, grass is green is a synthetic truth because it's not like a bachelor. Look, I just want to avoid saying Hume's fork, okay? But basically, you can imagine a red grass or a blue grass, but you can't imagine a married bachelor or a 4-sided triangle. So you now understand why this analytic-synthetic distinction is a bit controversial as I try and explain it. Anyway. Ding, 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 ding. Water boils at 100 degrees centigrade is an example of a synthetic truth because you couldn't work that out purely by examining the concept of water. You'd have to do an experiment or something. Likewise, frogs exist is an example of a synthetic truth. Mount Everest is the tallest mountain in the world is another example of a synthetic truth. Again, it's not true by definition. In theory, you could find another mountain that's even taller. Or octopuses have 3 hearts and blue blood is another example of a synthetic truth. Because just by knowing what an octopus is, what the concept means, you can't learn that it has 3 hearts and blue blood. In general, most synthetic truths can only be verified a posteriori, after some sort of experience or observation. So, returning to the examples a couple of seconds ago, frogs exist could only be verified a posteriori. You couldn't work out that frogs exist purely by thinking or locked within a cell with no access to the outside world. unless a frog came into your cell, but getting bogged down in the example again. You're locked in a cell, no contact with the outside world. You can't work out a priori that frogs exist, or that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth, or that water boils at 100 degrees C. You can't work those things out a priori. And so most synthetic truths can only be verified a posteriori. But the question, at least for the intuition and deduction topic, is whether this relationship holds true all the time or whether there are exceptions. And so the rationalists claim that there are exceptions, that there are some synthetic truths that can be learned purely a priori using intuition and deduction. Now, in plain English, this is like saying that we can use the mind and thinking to learn about the world outside of our minds. So Descartes, the great Descartes, is another philosopher who could be characterized as a rationalist, not so much for his belief in innate knowledge, but more through his use of intuition and deduction to learn about the world. So, at the start of Meditations, Descartes wants to work out what he can know. He wants his knowledge to be built from the ground up, from firm foundations, and so to do this, he starts by doubting everything that's possible to doubt. By the end of the first meditation, Descartes is doubting all his perceptions and experiences. In other words, he's doubting all a posteriori knowledge, and actually he goes even further than that, but we'll talk about that more in the next video. Anyway, Descartes doubts the evidence of his senses, of his perceptions, because it's possible that all those experiences and perceptions were just illusions or lies put there by an extremely powerful evil demon that's deceiving him. If you think about how you can sometimes be dreaming and not realize it, or films like The Matrix where your entire life is a lie and you don't realize it, that's kind of the point Descartes is getting at here. It's possible that everything you've ever seen or heard is a lie, and so you can't trust it as a source of knowledge. It's possible to doubt. And so the point, at least as far as this rationalism versus empiricism debate is concerned, is that Descartes has ruled out any a posteriori sources of knowledge. And so from this foundation of extreme doubt, all Descartes has is a priori methods through which he can rebuild his knowledge. In other words, he has to use his intuition and deduction, just the powers of his mind, to get himself out of this skeptical quagmire. The phrase cogito ergo sum, Latin for I think, therefore I am, is probably the single most famous bit of philosophy ever. So what does it mean? Well, I mentioned earlier how at the end of the first meditation, Descartes is doubting pretty much all his knowledge because it's possible that he could be being deceived by an extremely powerful evil demon. However, and this is the point of the cogito argument, even if that is the case, even if Descartes is being deceived by an evil demon and everything he's ever seen or heard has been a lie, he can't doubt he exists because there has to be something that's being deceived by the evil demon in the first place. The full phrase of the cogito argument is dubito ergo cogito ergo sum, which translates to I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. For Descartes, the cogito argument is an example of a rational intuition. It's not something that's learned via experience, and it's not even a deduction. Instead, says Descartes, and this is a direct quote, I am, I exist, is necessarily true every time I express it or conceive of it in my mind. So, a priori intuition, rational intuition, as Descartes says. It's kind of the ability of the mind to see that certain propositions are true just by thinking about them. And this is important in the rationalism versus empiricism debate because, remember, empiricism says that a priori methods such as intuition and deduction can only tell us analytic truths. But here, with the cogito argument, Descartes has established the synthetic truth, I am, or I exist, using only a priori, intuition and deduction. So if this argument works and is entirely a priori, then Descartes has proved rationalism is correct and empiricism is false. So you can think of the previous cogito argument as a sort of springboard from which Descartes is attempting to rebuild his knowledge. But obviously, I exist isn't much knowledge, and at this stage in the Meditations, all a posteriori knowledge is still off limits. Descartes still can't trust his perceptions and his experience. So from this platform, Descartes continues working within the a priori limits of his own mind to try and establish further synthetic truths beyond simply I exist. The cogito argument was an example of a rational intuition, but the other tool Descartes has, the other a priori method Descartes can use to learn about the world, is logical deduction. So logical deduction is the use of reasoning to derive true propositions using logical necessity from what is already known. So, for example, if I were to allow you that all cats are mammals and that Dave is a cat, then using logical necessity, you could deduce that Dave is a mammal, because Dave is a mammal logically follows, is logically guaranteed by the previous two premises. So the next synthetic truth Descartes seeks to establish using only these a priori tools of intuition and deduction is that God exists. So Descartes gives a fair few arguments for God's existence in Meditations, but we'll cover most of them when we get onto the metaphysics of God topic. Instead today, we're only going to focus on Descartes' so-called trademark argument for the existence of God. So the trademark argument goes something a bit like this. Firstly, I have the idea of God within my mind. That's the starting point. And the idea of God is the idea of an infinite and perfect being, says Descartes. Then the next premise is what's known as the causal adequacy principle. Descartes says that the cause of an effect must have as much reality as the effect. So if that makes no sense whatsoever, perhaps picture getting punched by a ghost. Would that leave a physical mark? Presumably not, because the physical mark, such as a bruise, would have more reality than the cause, i.e. the ghost. And so the cause of the bruise would have less reality than the effect. And Descartes says that's not how things work. So applying this causal adequacy principle to the idea of God that Descartes has in his mind, Descartes says that the cause of this idea of God must have, as an infinite and perfect being, must have as much reality as an infinite and perfect being. And so an infinite and perfect being must exist. And so God exists. The trademark argument is called the trademark argument because Descartes seems to think of the idea of God as like a trademark that God sort of stamps in everybody's mind. And because of the causal adequacy principle, Descartes says that this trademark could only have been put there by God himself. And so with the trademark argument, Descartes has potentially established yet another synthetic truth that God exists using only the a priori sources of intuition and deduction. And Descartes doesn't stop there. Having established that I exist, the cogito argument, and that God exists, the trademark argument, Descartes seeks to establish a third synthetic truth using only the a priori sources of intuition and deduction. The synthetic truth that the external world and that mind-independent objects exist. So Descartes says he seems to perceive mind-independent objects as sort of physical substances. That's his starting point. And so his next step is to question the cause of these perceptions of physical objects. So Descartes rules out his own mind as the cause of his perceptions of these physical objects, because if it was his own mind that was causing these perceptions, then he'd be able to control what he perceived. Descartes' argument here is very similar to Locke's argument from the involuntary nature of perception that we looked at in the previous knowledge from perception video. So if Descartes' perceptions of physical objects aren't caused by himself, Descartes says the other two possibilities are objects themselves or God. Well, God exists, but if God was the cause of my perceptions, then that would be a bit misleading, because my perceptions seem to tell me that when I'm looking at a physical object, the object really exists outside my mind. And if it was just an image or a perception put there by God, and the object didn't really exist, then that'd be kind of a bit deceptive, and God as an infinite and perfect being doesn't do that. God wouldn't deceive me like that. So that only leaves the cause of the perception of objects as the objects themselves. In other words, Descartes says that the cause of his perceptions of physical objects are physical objects themselves, and so physical objects and the external world exists. So there you go, the external world exists, the third synthetic truth that Descartes has proved purely using a priori, intuition and deduction. Or has he? Perhaps as we were going through Descartes' three arguments using intuition and deduction just now, you sensed a few cheat moves along the way. You sensed that a few premises in Descartes' arguments here were not entirely a priori, but were perhaps a posteriori. And that's certainly what the empiricists would argue. The empiricists would argue that even if Descartes' conclusions are true and his arguments are sound, the arguments are not entirely a priori. There are instead a posteriori premises that could only be known with some degree of experience. One such empiricist is David Hume, and Hume's fork, not fork as in knife and fork, but fork in the road, distinguishes between two types of proposition: relations of ideas and matters of fact. I don't want to get bogged down in yet another set of definitions, especially since Hume's fork overlaps so closely with the a priori, a posteriori and analytic synthetic distinctions we've already made. So instead, I'm going to frame Hume's fork as a kind of test we can do to test whether a proposition can be known a priori or whether it can only be known a posteriori. Can you imagine the proposition being false? If not, then the proposition is what Hume would call a relation of ideas, and it can be known entirely a priori. But if the proposition we can imagine being false, then it's not a relation of ideas, says Hume, it's a matter of fact, and it can only be known a posteriori. So let's apply this test to a few propositions. For example, we can know triangles have three sides a priori because we can't conceive of it being false. If you try and imagine a four-sided triangle, for example, do it now. What are you imagining? Either you're imagining a four-sided shape, in which case you're imagining a square, or you're imagining a triangle. But the idea of a four-sided triangle is not an image you can bring to your mind. And so triangles have three sides would be a relation of ideas, according to Hume, and something that can be known entirely a priori. In contrast, if we apply the Hume's fork test to the proposition grass is green, it reveals it to be a matter of fact rather than a relation of ideas, because we can conceive of this proposition being false. For example, we could imagine blue grass or red grass. These ideas make perfect sense, they are conceivable, and so grass is green is a matter of fact and can only be known a posteriori, according to Hume. So if we apply this test, Hume's fork, to Descartes' arguments we looked at a minute ago, do we find any premises that we could conceive of as being false? If so, this would suggest that these arguments are not entirely a priori as Descartes claims. So working backwards, I can think of at least one premise in Descartes' argument for the existence of the external world and substance and mind-independent objects that is conceivably false and so fails Hume's fork, at least as a relation of ideas. So the premise I'm thinking of, if you remember, is when Descartes says his perceptions must be caused by something outside his mind because his perceptions are involuntary. But if we think about that premise, is it conceivable that it could be false? Is it conceivable that you could have perceptions that are involuntary but are nevertheless caused by your own mind? Well, yes. Dreams are one such example. So when you're dreaming, unless you can lucid dream, what happens is outside of your control. It's involuntary. And so this shows that it's perfectly conceivable, ordinary even, for perceptions to be caused entirely by your own mind and yet be involuntary. So Hume would say you cannot know a priori that your perceptions aren't caused entirely by your own mind. Even if it is ultimately true that your perceptions are caused by mind-independent objects, and so Descartes' conclusion here is true, Hume's fork shows that the reasoning is not entirely a priori because it's conceivable that it could be false. What's more, Descartes' argument for the existence of the external world and mind-independent objects relies on his previous argument that God exists, and so if we can show that the trademark argument, for example, relies on a posteriori matters of fact, then this further weakens the case that Descartes' argument for the existence of the external world is a synthetic truth proven only via a priori intuition and deduction. Hume's fork can also be used to argue that various premises in Descartes' trademark argument for the existence of God also rely on a posteriori matters of fact. For example, the causal adequacy principle, Descartes' premise that the cause of an effect must have as much reality as the effect. Applying Hume's fork to the causal adequacy principle raises the question of whether it's conceivable that we could imagine a cause with less reality than the effect. To conceive of a human being creating the idea of God is not a contradiction like a four-sided triangle. The idea makes sense. We can imagine perfectly coherently that a finite and imperfect human being could somehow create the idea of an infinite and perfect being. That's a coherent idea. And so Descartes would say this is a exception to the... Not Descartes, what am I saying? And so these examples show that the causal adequacy principle, even if it's true, it can't be known purely a priori because we can conceive of it being false. We need to do some investigation or observation of the real world in order to know that the cause and effect does indeed have as much reality as the effect. What's more, going back to the innate knowledge debate a minute ago, we can question where the concept of God in Descartes' mind comes from, whether this concept is entirely a priori. So Descartes claims the concept of God is stamped in his mind like a trademark from birth. So Descartes would claim the concept of God is innate, but we could use Locke's tabula rasa arguments and apply them to Descartes' claim that the concept of God is innate. So again, children and idiots, do they have the concept of God? If you look at a newborn baby, is there any evidence to suggest that the baby has the concept of God? If not, perhaps the concept of God, rather than being a trademark that's stamped in our minds from birth, as Descartes claims, perhaps the concept comes from experience. As Locke points out, there are entire atheist cultures of adults who lack the concept of God. And so this further weakens the claim that the concept of God is a priori. And so if the concept of God requires experience, then this is further reason to argue that Descartes' trademark argument fails to establish the synthetic truth God exists purely using a priori means. Finally, the cogito argument, I exist. Now, this argument withstood even the evil demon scenario, so surely this most certain of propositions can withstand Hume's empiricist fork. Well, the cogito argument is probably the strongest candidate for synthetic a priori knowledge, but Hume's fork takes this on too. So Hume argues that all we ever experience is a bundle of perceptions. We experience constantly changing thoughts and sensations, but we never actually experience a self. In other words, we never experience the thinker of the thoughts, only the thoughts themselves. And so the jump that Descartes makes from I think to I am or I exist doesn't necessarily follow. At least it doesn't follow a priori. It's a strange idea to imagine, but we can at least conceive of a thought without a thinker, and so all thoughts have thinkers. If it's true as a matter of fact rather than a relation of ideas. Perhaps we could imagine the evil demon is just creating a bunch of disembodied thoughts that I exist. This is a conceivable idea. It's not like a four-sided triangle or a married bachelor. And so, again, even if all thoughts have thinkers is true, and so Descartes' jump from I think to I am is sound, Hume would argue that at most, the cogito argument proves that thoughts exist a priori, but that it requires some a posteriori reasoning to jump from the thoughts to a thing that exists and is thinking these thoughts. So to sum up the intuition and deduction debate, the rationalists say we can use a priori intuition and deduction to establish knowledge of synthetic truths. Now in plain English, this is like saying that we can use the mind and thinking to learn about the world outside of our minds. But the empiricists disagree. So we saw how Descartes, the rationalist, attempts to provide proofs of three synthetic truths: I exist, God exists, and the external world exists, using only a priori intuition and deduction. But we saw how Hume's fork challenges whether these arguments really are entirely a priori, or whether some of the premises rely on a posteriori experience. However, like I mentioned at the start of this video, this debate is a little bit artificial because a lot of the terms such as rationalism, empiricism, analytic and synthetic didn't even exist when a lot of these philosophers were writing. For example, Descartes had been dead for over 100 years when Kant invented the analytic and synthetic distinction, so it's a bit of a stretch to say that Descartes was trying to prove synthetic truths using a priori intuition and deduction when Descartes wouldn't have even had the concept of a synthetic truth. Similarly, Descartes died long before Hume came along, and so we can only speculate how Descartes might defend, or not, the cogito argument against Hume's fork. The reality is most of the philosophers we've talked about today don't fall perfectly into either rationalists or empiricists. And indeed, the understandings of these very terms, rationalism and empiricism, aren't very clearly defined and have changed a lot over the years. That said, I still think this is an interesting topic because it gets us thinking about where our knowledge comes from, how we justify it, and how certain we can be of it, which is the topic of the next video. Congratulations on making it to the end of another one of my dumb philosophy videos, but I hope you enjoyed it. Now it's time for my favourite part of these videos, which is the bit where I review the book. So as always, you can get my book. Obviously, that one gets a thumbs up from me. It basically goes over the same stuff we went through today, the rationalism versus empiricism topic, broken down into the innate knowledge stuff and the intuition and deduction stuff. Then as far as primary sources, we got a lot to get through today. Once again, we've got Locke's essay concerning human understanding. I know I ripped on it in the last video, but it is really boring and long, so I don't know. But just to prove I'm not biased against empiricists, David Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding gets a thumbs up from me. I like this book, not just because it's shorter, but because it's just more interesting. Then to complete the trilogy of human understanding, we've got Leibniz's new essays on human understanding. Now, for a guy who had such a kind of flamboyant wig, his writing style is surprisingly clear, and I really like this book actually, so that one definitely gets a thumbs up from me. Surprise. And then Plato's Meno. I always recommend people Plato's dialogues, but I've hardly read any of them myself, but they are quite readable. I've read the slave boy bit of this book, and yeah, it's enjoyable, so thumbs up from me. And then got to get both thumbs up for this one, Descartes Meditations. Now, I know I always bang on about it, but I really do like this book. It really is this is what philosophy is all about. So yeah, love Descartes Meditations. Anyway, I'm going a bit mad, so it's probably best to close the video off there. Thank you so much, as always, for watching, and yeah, we will see you in the next one.